Hey everyone, and welcome to the Golf EQ podcast. Right here is where you'll find everything behind the scenes of Golf EQ. Welcome to episode 5. Today we are talking about the golf bag, everything that you put in there from top to bottom, where you can, find the best value for your money, what you should be looking for, what you should concentrate on. Should you have 14 clubs in the bag? What is the yardage of clubs you should be looking at? All those sorts of things. We got Damon here who's going to be answering all our questions. He is the golf EQ aficionado, and it's really exciting what we're going to be doing here. So if you guys aren't subscribed, please do so, and like and share our videos. That's only going to help things further, give you guys more information. Anything we're talking about today, we'll have links in the description below, so make sure to check on that. Make sure to check out our website, www.golf-eq.com. Right there, you can get on the golf identifier, read articles on certain clubs, reviews on new clubs and old clubs. Everything is really great. A lot of good content on there, so please go check it out. So today, again, Damon, we're talking about really everything. Talking about the golf bag overall. What gets the most overlooked. A lot of people may concentrate on their driver just because it's what's going to give them the most yardage, right? But maybe it's more about the irons, the hybrids, wedges, whatever it is. So what are you thinking about when it comes to filling in your golf bag? What's the most important thing to look at?
Yeah, well, like a lot of things in golf, it is player specific. So, if a player is really great with their driver, maybe they have to think less about that. They spend a little more time on their irons, wedges, maybe even their putter. Vice versa, if somebody's a great putter, maybe they think about that significantly less, and they have to dial in a driver because they're giving up strokes there. Generally speaking, people pay most attention to the driver, and the driver is the one that gets the most attention. Oftentimes it's the most fun to hit on the range. Many times golfers practice with it the most, and that's totally okay. So golfers are more likely to upgrade their driver, kind of maybe not every season, but definitely more frequently than they'll be upgrading their irons or they'll be upgrading their wedges. And that's a perfectly fine approach. I think it makes a lot of sense. Driver plays a significant role in kind of your strokes gained performance off the tee, and it also leads into your strokes gained performance of approach. So you're going to have a significantly better chance to hit greens if you're hitting more fairways, and if you're hitting it longer, so you're giving yourself less yards into the green, you're going to have a better chance to make birdie, make pars, those kind of things, escape trouble, all that stuff. So I think beginning with driver is a really, really good place to start. The biggest problem that I see bridging from driver to the rest of the golf bag is people tend to use a lot of their energy to really dial in their driver and then almost neglect or give basically only afterthought to the rest of their golf bag. And that's when people really start to get into problems. And there's a lot of significant performance gains that exist in dialing in your entire golf bag kind of top to bottom. And that includes making sure your gapping is right? So are you hitting, your 3-wood or 4-wood or 5-wood the right distance? Do you have hybrids or long irons that blend? What does your combination set of irons look like? How many hybrids do you have? Do you have high lofted fairway woods? Do you have a combo iron set that is, a thicker cavity back in the long irons down to a thinner cavity back, or a player's iron in shorter irons? Where do you blend wedges? How many wedges do you have? Those kind of things. What are the loft gaps of your wedges? Is everything flying the right distance? And obviously putter is kind of a standalone category where you should basically just be getting something that matches your stroke and that you feel comfortable with. And then, like we've said many times, the most often overlooked thing is the golf ball. And you're using the golf ball with every single one of those clubs. And it has to be played in a variety of different conditions and do a lot of things for you. So you need to be making sure that you're paying specific attention to the golf ball, making sure that's a complement to all your clubs in the bag, and making sure that as you take those jumps, driver to fairway to hybrid to long irons, to short irons to wedges, that you've really kind of given yourself the ability to hit any of the shots that you're going to need to hit when you're playing golf. And that's different for different people.
Right. Yeah, you mentioned, the yardage between clubs, and, iron wise, it's probably doesn't make much difference, what you recommend. I'm sure the majority of golfers out there are going to have like a pitch and wedge to a 4-iron. But, once you're getting past that 4-iron phase, where are things going in terms of driving irons, hybrids, woods, that sort of thing? How much yardage, should there be between golf clubs in general?
Yeah, it's a question that a lot of people really don't have a solid answer for. And the reason being is that it is, again, player specific. And as a general rule, the more speed you have, the more distance there should be between irons. And that's where, depending on your swing speed, it may be that you need fewer irons than somebody else with higher speeds. Like, for example, players on the PGA Tour who have an average driver speed of somewhere around 112, 115 miles per hour, they need all 14 golf clubs because they have large enough distance gaps between, say, 4 iron and 5 iron, 5 iron and 6 iron, all the way down, that they need clubs in those gaps. Whereas your amateur golfer, if they're only swinging a driver at somewhere around 95 miles per hour, they probably don't have a reason for a 4 iron and a 5 iron and a 4 hybrid, something like that. One or two of those three clubs can probably play all the roles. And then that's when you can get really kind of creative. And are you building a 3-wood that can go from the turf and from a tee? So do you have a 2 3-wood bag? Do you possibly have an extra wedge that allows you to get out of trouble? Do you have a 3-wood, a hybrid, and a driving iron, right? So you can play kind of any shot off the tee. That's when you can really get more creative, if you don't just kind of go with the stock standard setup. And the other big mistake that people make in distance gapping, especially, is they assume that the standard loft gaps are going to give them the right distance gaps. And that's not always the case. So I'll give you a couple of examples that I see at the top end of the bag. And then also there's a couple of examples I see at the bottom of the bag. So when players transition from fairway woods into higher lofted fairway woods or hybrids, and then they move into the long iron. So a lot of times what you'll see is you'll get a player that has a 3-wood at 15 degrees, and then you'll get a player with a 3 hybrid at, let's call it 19 or 20 degrees. That same player may also have a 4 iron that is somewhere around the low 20s. So let's call it 21, 22, 23 degrees. A lot of times those two clubs will overlap. So that 3 hybrid and that 4 iron may be going the same distance, but with slightly different flights. And that's okay. If you want to hit the hybrid a little bit higher and the 4 iron a little bit lower, and you want to play those different shots, it can be okay to have both those clubs. But most often what we find is that 4 iron is useless in the overall scope of the golf bag. But then transitioning from that 3 hybrid at 19 or 20 degrees into a 5 iron somewhere around the mid 20s, 24, 25, 26 degrees, that can be really powerful. And so that gap gives people a large enough kind of window to hit different shots. And then going ahead to transition into their 6 iron, 7 iron, 8 iron, 9 iron down into pitching wedge. Normally, irons are loft gapped at about 4 degrees. And then it does shrink a little bit in the longer iron. That becomes about a 3 degrees gap. There is a kind of the physical reason for that. At the lower lofts, 1 degree difference actually makes a larger change of distance, everything being equal. So as long as you have enough speed to hit those irons high enough and far enough, you will see adequate distance gapping with 3 degrees. But in my experience, I actually see players benefiting from 4 or so degrees, even in those longer irons, because of the inconsistencies of strike and sometimes because of the slower speeds. So I kind of do recommend that a lot of people stop their iron sets at 5 iron, or what would be kind of that mid 20s loft range. So 24, 25, 26, something like that is probably going to be the lowest lofted iron that a lot of people should be playing. Now, obviously, if you're hitting a bunch of irons off the tee or something, then that can kind of bring in other differences. But as a general rule, hitting it off the ground, that 25, 24, 25 degree loft mark is going to be about the lowest you're going to want to go.
Yeah. Wouldn't you say, like we mentioned with the fairway woods, in the previous episode, how lie can affect things and where you find yourselves, consistently on the golf course. So like maybe you're not hitting a lot of fairways and you're finding yourself in the rough, maybe you do want that hybrid to be able to kind of get through there a little bit easier. Would you say there's like a big yardage difference there? If I was going to hit a 4-wood versus a hybrid out of the rough?
Yeah, it can be massive. And again, the lie, like you're saying, so the lie of the golf ball, not necessarily the lie of the golf club, but the lie of the golf ball being in kind of one type of grass or the other is going to have a massive impact on a player's ability to get through it. What I will say is it's hard. We don't have enough data yet to really be able to tell you definitively what type of golfer is better off with a high lofted fairway wood or a similar lofted hybrid. So like, for example, if you have an 18-degree 5 wood and an 18-degree 3 hybrid, we don't have enough data yet to really be able to tell you what type of golfer would be best in either one of those clubs. What we can tell you is that in most lies, almost all golfers are better off with that compared to an iron. So let's say you have a 4 iron at roughly 21 degrees and you have a 3 hybrid at roughly 20 degrees.
That's me.
The hybrid is going to be, it's a lot of people, and it makes perfect sense. But the hybrid in that scenario coming from the rough is going to be significantly better than the iron for almost all golfers. It's just as a general rule, those clubs are much less likely to twist as they've gotten grabbed by the grass, and they just give people a little more forgiveness, especially high and low compared to the irons. And the one thing that people kind of don't always recognize immediately when the golf ball is lying in the rough is that golf ball may not be laying perfectly on the ground, right? It may be half an inch or a quarter inch above the ground, and that plays a vital role in where you're going to strike that golf ball in the face. And irons have much less forgiveness high in the club face compared to those hybrids or those fairway woods that you're talking about.
Yeah. Let's talk about loft. You mentioned, traditionally it's 3 to 4 degrees between clubs. Do you feel like less loft always means more distance? Or is it, really more about, golfer dependent, of course, on their swing speed and all that stuff. But, what do you think? What about like the golfer that is maybe flipping at the ball a little bit? Should they have a club? Should they maybe be going a little bit less lofts on their bag?
Yeah. So basically, the things I can tell you is loft and what loft you should be playing is highly dependent on swing speed and angle of attack. So very, very kind of generally, angle of attack will define the dynamic loft in a relationship to the static loft. So what I mean by that is let's take a standard. Let's take our 5 iron that we've been talking about at 25 degrees. Okay, if we have a 5 iron at 25 degrees and somebody hits slightly up on that 5 iron, meaning the angle of attack is slightly up or positive, that person's likely going to add a little bit of loft. So the dynamic loft that they present might be somewhere around 28 degrees, let's say, as an example. Conversely, if somebody's negative or down in their angle of attack, they're going to take loft off of that 25 degree 5 iron. So their presented loft might be 20 degrees, let's say. So the dynamic loft is what's going to dictate a lot of launch and spin. So depending on that, that's when you really have to get creative about where you're bending lofts, what loft you're giving that person, those kind of things. So if you're heavy down, you can start with more loft because what you're really doing is you're presenting less loft and then you're given loft of the golf club. Opposite, if you're hitting up on it, you may need to start with less loft because you're adding loft. So that's when, again, it all comes down to kind of a player specific basis, specifically swing speed and angle of attack.
Yeah, of course. So when it comes to the bag, by the golf rules, you're allowed up to 14 clubs, but you can have 2 clubs in the bag. It doesn't matter. Do you feel like you should take advantage of that 14 number, or maybe just tone it back a little bit? Maybe some players, are inclined to use one club just because it's new or something like that, and they're just having trouble with it. Would you advise them to maybe cut back a little bit?
I think because you can always have 14 clubs, it's probably in most players' best interest to go ahead and fill out all 14 clubs. But how they do that, I think, needs to be a little more thoughtful than just sticking with a standard set. So like I said, for example, most oftentimes your 14 clubs are driver, 3 wood, some sort of 5 wood and or hybrid. And you've got 4 iron down to pitching wedge. And then you've got a couple different, specialty wedges in there. Maybe you got a gap wedge, a sand wedge, a lob wedge, and then you go into putter. Well, what I would rather see most players doing is, like I said, dropping that 4 iron, kind of only going down to about 25 degrees in their lowest iron loft, and then maybe adding in a higher lofted fairway wood, a fairway wood they feel more comfortable with off the tee, a driving iron for some of those tighter, par 4s or long par 3s, maybe even a specialty wedge like what we were seeing with a lot of these brands from, kind of the high toe model, like the original Callaway kind of Phil Mickelson grind style wedges, to where maybe you give yourself a little more flexibility. You can carry it in 2 different degrees. Maybe you have a 56 sand wedge that you hit for standard kind of longer shots, and you have a 58-degree, high toe style, kind of lob / sand wedge that allows you to kind of escape. Maybe it's a little bit easier to play out of the bunkers. Maybe it's a little bit easier to play out of thick rough around the greens, those kind of things. So I think thinking about, playing 12 to 13 clubs as a standard set in your bag, and then using that 14th spot to maybe give yourself more options, right? Throw in that driving iron that you only hit for low punches when you're trying to escape trouble, or off the tee on one hole of the golf course that you play most frequently, versus putting a 4-iron in your bag that literally gives you no additional shot making potential. And it's just kind of a wasted space because you bought it with your iron set and you didn't really think, much further than that. Because the other thing that I see a lot is, especially in newer iron sets, the lofts get really strong and players leave themselves with too large a gap between their pitching wedge and their gap wedge. And this is kind of a really important point we should talk about with a little bit of depth, I think, because I see a lot of mistakes in this, and it's twofold. Number one, if you are buying a kind of larger cavity back, think kind of player improvement irons in the pitching wedge category, sometimes that pitching wedge loft is getting as low as 44 degrees, let's say. That's compounded by the fact that there might be a little more technology in that pitching wedge than you have in your matching gap wedge, right? So a lot of players aren't buying the set and match gap wedge, they're buying a true kind of specialty wedge, like let's call it, a Titleist Vokey wedge, right? So it's kind of a little more thin, a little more player shape, kind of almost more similar to a blade than it is to their kind of game improvement cavity back. And so what happens is you compound that distance difference. Number one, there's a loft difference. And then number two, you give a little more juice, a little more ball speed out of that pitching wedge compared to that smaller profile wedge. So what ends up happening is you get a pitching wedge at 44 degrees. And if you just go standard gap wedge, you're looking at 50 or even up to 52 degrees in that gap wedge. And that 6 to 8 degree gap is 2 clubs, not 1. And so what you really have is you have a massive hole there for a lot of golfers in between pitching wedge and gap wedge. And so what I would like to see is, if you do have that 44 degree pitching wedge, what you should be thinking about is going 48 degrees in your gap wedge, up to 52, 53 in your kind of sandish wedge, and then up to 56 to 58 in your kind of higher lofted sand and lob wedge. And that's where, if you aren't really using your 4-iron, you could add that other wedge and give yourself a wider range in the short end. So you could go 44 in your pitching wedge, 48 in a gap wedge, 52 in a second gap wedge, 56 in a sand wedge, and then up to 60 or 58 in your lob wedge, depending on what loft you're comfortable with. So that's an area that I see people overlooking a lot, because a lot of people just buy the pitching wedge. They don't understand what the loft of that pitching wedge is, and they just buy a gap wedge at 52, a sand wedge at 56, and a lob wedge at 60, or a gap wedge at 50, a sand wedge at 54, and a lob wedge at 58, without really giving much thought to how those are going to blend. And they leave themselves with a 15 to 20 yard gap in the low end of their bag, when 15 to 20 yards might mean the difference in hitting a green versus missing a green, right, where it doesn't between 4-iron and 5-iron, because a lot of times those are flying the same distance anyway.
Yeah, that's your scoring range. A lot of, again, people are always thinking about like the clubs that you hit the farthest, are most important. But I mean, 100 yards and in is everything. So yeah, I totally agree with that. And I'm gonna switch things up too, because I have as part of my iron set is pitch and wedge and gap wedge, and then I get into my thinner wedges, like you said. I got a 56 and a 60, so I'm probably too high in my 2 wedges.
I think
like
you're
a
probably
52, like you said.
Yeah, I think you're probably right, because a lot of times what happens, and that's a great point that I didn't really touch on a second ago, is if you do go with the set matched gap wedge, being the gap wedge is the exact same iron model as your pitching wedge and your 7-iron and so on and so on. A lot of times what happens is you do get into, like, your pitching wedge, just guessing, I don't know exactly what irons you're playing, but your pitching wedge is probably at the 44 to 45 degree range. And then that gap wedge they gave you is probably 48 or 49. So you're probably going, at best, you're going probably 49 to 56, which is a 7 degree gap, which is huge. almost guaranteed to be too much. And then at worst case, you're going from like 48 to 56, which is 8 yards. And that's essentially 2 entire clubs at that bottom end of your golf bag.
Yeah, it makes sense now that I'm coming short a
Mhm.
lot of
Yep.
times. Well, that's good to know. So, when we're looking at, we've talked about purchasing new clubs and, what we're going to do, new versus old or used, I should say. Is there anything wrong with buying used? Where should they go? What should they look at? Are there things that could be wrong, like that aren't really necessarily visible to the eye, like a wedge, obviously? Obviously you can see that the grooves are worn down. You never should buy a used wedge. But other things like to the driver, to any irons that, a golfer can maybe look at, feel, to see that there are any issues.
Not really. So I would say that for the most part, if you're buying used drivers, fairway woods, hybrids, and irons, you're okay. The only thing you have to check is that it's a decent fit. So like you're not going to be able to get custom fit for those used irons in most cases, right? So you need to make sure the shaft weight is okay, the shaft flex is okay, and the iron head model matches your swing. And then you have to go immediately I would recommend anybody that buys any new club, regardless of whether they're new or used, go to their local kind of club fitting shop or club mechanic if they have one, and get the lofts and the lies checked and bent for their specific delivery. So especially with forged clubs, this becomes very important for irons. They get stored somewhere in the heat, car trunks, garages, those kinds of things. They bend over time, especially if they're getting hit a lot. So the lofts aren't necessarily what they should be. And so same for the lies. So they should be getting those things checked as soon as they buy new irons, I would say. And then really the only detriment we see in used clubs is, like you said, the wedges. And that's strictly a function of the grooves wearing out. So the lifetime of a wedge, for a PGA Tour player is less than a year, which is too extreme for most amateur golfers. But definitely, I would say 3 years is somewhere probably around the maximum lifetime of a wedge, depending on how much time you're playing and practicing with them. So grooves work to help maintain spin out of different conditions, in the rough, out of the bunker, things like that. So as soon as those grooves, the sharpness of those grooves starts to diminish, or you start to get significant wear on those scratches, you start to wear out different parts of the face, depending on where you strike it, you're going to see performance drop-offs, especially when coming from those different lies. That's going to make it very hard to keep your spin high enough. It's going to be very difficult to hold greens, that kind of thing. So I would say do not buy used wedges unless you can see them for yourself and you can see they've barely been hit. You've got a friend or somebody that, bought a new set, tried them, didn't like the fit, those kind of things. Then it would be perfect. Maybe they've only played 2 rounds, 10 rounds, something like that. That would be definitely okay. But other than that, I mean, drivers, fairway woods, irons, like I said, those are good for several years, and it's a great way to get, upgraded performance without having to spend a lot of money. In fact, I would much rather see people buy last year's driver and save the $200 to $300, whatever it could be, and go out and buy high quality golf balls with the difference in that money, than I would see them buy the new driver and then buying used golf balls, which
Yeah.
are always worse. Used golf balls are an absolute kind of no. So
Yeah. Yeah. And, especially that couple $100, like you said, you can get the, Titleist wedges, you get 2 of them,
yep.
maybe even, get a 52 and a 56. That's going to tremendously change your game. So that's interesting. So how about like the rest of the bag? Like, we talk about driver and irons, like, is there any certain number of years, based on, like, say a golfer that, gets out once a week, what would you say is a good time frame for them to replace any of those clubs?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And if that person's fit is really good, then you're looking probably somewhere on the timeline of maybe 5 or 6 years. So if you or I, we have a really, really great fitting driver, that driver is going to compete for probably the next 5 or 6 product cycles. I mean, that's, the technology is capped by the rules of golf, and then kind of your quote unquote stability or forgiveness measurements, they only go up slightly every year. And so
Right.
really what you gain at year over year is you gain slightly different clubhead models that can be matched to a wider or a more narrow set of golf deliveries. basically. And so when you find one that fits your delivery, you're really pretty set in the driver category. Like I said, for 3 to 5 years. Now, if something catches your eye and you really just want something new,
Yeah.
that's totally fine. But as far as your actual performance, once you get dialed in, you're kind of set for what I would call roughly 5 years. After 5 years, there's enough changes in your body, there's enough changes in your delivery, there's enough changes in technology that all those things compound to where it definitely warrants going to get checked. And then it probably becomes almost time for an upgrade. Because the other thing that does happen is depending on how often you're playing, your driver does wear down. And so those faces kind of thin. Sometimes they get a little more speed. Sometimes they risk breaking if you're not storing them in the right kind of room temperature conditions and dry, not too humid conditions. The shaft loses a little bit of integrity over time. So these are materials that kind of degrade. Yeah, it's not usually an issue, but if people are leaving them in their car trunks, for example, or really hot garages, for 100 degrees for 3 months out of the year or something like that, then they can really start to see some wear and tear over time. And usually around that 5-year mark is when you're like, might be time to go ahead and upgrade and try to find something new. The one thing I'll add to that is, especially if you're playing a lot, like you said, the golfer that plays one time a week, they should be re-gripping their clubs at minimum once a year. So the grips are the first things to go, especially in
twice
things
a
like,
year.
yeah, exactly. The things, wedges and drivers, especially, they get hit a lot, will definitely need. Now, your irons can last maybe longer than a year because, you may only practice with your 7-iron, so you may have to swap that one out. But your 9-iron, for example, may only get swung 3 times around, and so you're only using it on the golf course, so it gets swung less. So you don't have to, just because you change one grip, I mean, you have to change all the grips. But typically, you get a little price discount if you buy all the grips at one time. You get them all installed, that kind of thing. So, as a good rule of thumb, I would say, when you pull the clubs out after the winter break, go ahead and throw some new grips on them, and then every 5 years, roughly, let's go ahead and revisit your clubs that you've had, see if it's time for a new fit. That kind of goes for driver. I would say the same thing applies for fairway woods, although fairway woods can go even longer because sometimes you're not trying to get maximum distance with fairway woods, you're trying to hit your number. That becomes a little bit easier. If you find a fairway that you're really, really comfortable with, hybrids kind of in the same boat. Irons tend to be, I would think, around that 5-year window, depending on how often you're playing, just because eventually you are going to start wearing the grooves of the irons out. And similar to the wedges, although to a much lessened degree, the performance out of the rough, those kind of things, is going to fall off pretty sharply after the integrity of those grooves become damaged.
Yeah, I'm definitely due. That's for sure. That's an interesting point about storing your clubs. I'm sure, the majority of golfers out there are putting them in their garages. And if you and I are in North Carolina, we're getting, especially now, 95 degree days, and, it's even reaching, 100 and above. My clubs have been in my garage for 5 years now, going through those summer times. Do you think like there's some degrading there, like that's going on with the shaft or the club head?
Could be. I mean, I think it's definitely worth a check. I don't think you could say for sure, because I don't know.
How would I check that?
Well, you'd have to, what I would say is the best way to check it would be to go for a club fit. And when you do go for that club fit, bring your clubs. And so what you're really trying to decide is your club still performing at the highest level possible for you? Okay. And if you're finding things that are outperforming your club, then the answer to that question is no. Now, it doesn't necessarily answer the question is that club underperformed because it was stored in the garage, or is that club simply underperformed because maybe your golf swing's changed a little bit, maybe the technology's moved slightly past it. But ultimately, it doesn't matter. The only thing you're trying to check is, do I still currently have the golf clubs that are best for my golf swing and thus give me the best chance to score my best on the golf course? Okay. And if the answer to that question is no, then you don't really care so much as to why the answer is no. You just go ahead and fix the problem if there is one.
Makes sense. Makes you feel better. Cool. Yeah, I think that's all the questions I have for you. Was there anything else that you wanted to add?
No, I don't think so. I think just as a final thought, I do encourage people to really think critically about their entire golf bag. Don't just stop at driver. Think about what fairway wedge you're mixing in, hybrids, irons, all the way down to wedges. Pay special attention to that area between pitching wedge and gap wedge, because I see people getting that wrong a lot. And as always, make sure you're paying attention to the golf ball.
Yeah, I would love to see that study of how often people are replacing their drivers versus the rest of their bag. Because I bet you it's skewed tremendously.
Yeah, I would have to imagine you're right.
Yeah, cool. All right, guys. Well, thank you for joining us here in episode 5, talking about golf clubs, your golf bag. Again, check out the website, www.golf-eq.com. Any questions that you may have, leave a comment down below. That will just give us more content to put out, later for next week and the weeks following. So yeah, please subscribe again. Check out the website. Check out, Damon, ask him any questions. He's happy to help you with anything. And we'll see you next time. Thank you.